Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. From the perspective of the NCAA's national office, no one has seen more change in the last 35 years than former Vice President Dan Dutcher. From just 2 divisions to today's 3, all the while working with countless coaches, presidents, and athletic directors and colleagues, Dan has seen it all. He joins me today to talk about the challenges facing Division III institutions and their leaders today. The overwhelming number of Division III institutions are small, private, liberal arts. Faced with shifting demographics in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, enrollment managers have begun to partner with coaches and athletics departments to co-curate incoming classes of students. It's a shift that has only materialized in the past 5 years and will grow in importance over the next decade. How are the NCAA members adjusting to the new landscape of athletes becoming a crucial part of the financial success and survival of many of these well-known schools? My guest today is Dan Dutcher. He retired as the NCAA's Vice President for Division III in early 2021, concluding a distinguished career with the association. He currently serves as a collegiate athletics consultant. He led Division III, the NCAA's largest division, for 25 years. In that role, he served as Chief Staff Liaison to the Division III President's Council and the Management Council, and oversaw the division's 30 other committees. He was directly responsible for Division III's strategic plan, policy process, and its $30 million annual budget. He has also served on the President's Cabinet. Dan, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm looking forward to it.
So let's give our listeners just a kind of a broader overview. We hear the word transformation, and I've talked about transformation with conference commissioners, other college presidents, but looking from the national office perspective, and you've had such a great, terrific career in the NCAA, 25 years working in, you have seen tremendous change. So what does this word transformation mean to you?
I think we are at an inflection point in intercollegiate athletics. And I think by definition, that includes the NCAA. There are certain time periods in the history of the NCAA that I think have been really important. And I would say we're in another one of those periods. I go back to the early 70s when the NCAA was 2 divisions and a 3rd division was created. I go back to the mid 90s when the NCAA restructured formally, put presidents at the head of each of the divisions, created an executive committee, now board of governors, implemented federation, which really gave each of the divisions more autonomy to do their own things. I think that was another crucial time period. I think this period is analogous to those time periods where there are lots of external pressures. There are lots of internal pressures, and the organization itself, but beyond that, its membership is really challenged with how to respond to those pressures and how to plot a course forward for, let's say, the next 20 or 30 years. So if you look at the time period, we talked about the 70s, add 20, 25 years, you're in the mid 90s, add 20, 25 years. Here we are. I don't think it's necessarily automatically a 25-year cycle, but I think we're at another one of those inflection points. And I think some of those challenges are internal, and I think some of those challenges are external. Certainly on the internal front, the NCAA is such a large organization. We've got about 1,000 member schools and conferences. There's so much diversity within the NCAA membership. You've got large public schools, you've got smaller private schools, you've got faith-based institutions, you've got schools with huge athletic budgets, 200+ million. You've got schools with very smaller athletic budgets. You've got schools that award athletics aid at a large amount. You've got schools that award smaller amounts of athletics aid, and you've got Division III, which is 40% of the NCAA membership, doesn't award athletics aid at all. You've got about 600,000 student athletes. It's a very large organization in terms of its membership, and it's a large organization in terms of its structure. So for better or worse, the NCAA is a large bureaucracy. It's a huge organization, and it does its work through committees. Those committees are comprised of representatives from member schools, supported by the national office staff. You got about, at any given time, about 130 committees. You've probably got about 1,000 or so people from the NCAA membership that populate those committees. You've got about 450 to 500 staff that help to support the whole operation. It's very complicated and it's very challenging, but I don't think there's any question that external forces, beyond just the internal challenge of trying to keep together an organization that's that large and that diverse, there are external pressures now as well. So if you're looking at things related to litigation, you're looking at political pressures, you're looking at pressure from the media. There was a point in time, and we can talk further about this from an historical perspective, but there was a point in time, certainly through the first 10 years of my career, and you're right, I served for 25 years to head Division III, but I served 10 years before that working in all three divisions, so it was about a 35-year run. There was a period in time when I think in general, most folks felt like the student athlete had a fair deal. And when I say that, I include student athletes in all three divisions. The idea was you would get a scholarship to get an education. And your commitment was that you would compete as a student athlete for member schools. And if you're a Division I or II student athlete, your scholarship was directly related to that activity of participating in collegiate athletics. And, most folks felt like that was a pretty fair deal. And then with time, and my personal belief is it may have had something to do with the first $1 billion broadcast agreement that the NCAA signed and the first $1 million contract that was awarded to a coach. With time, folks that originally felt like that was a pretty fair deal began to sort of, that perspective began to erode. And I really look at 5 groups that I think over time we began to lose the belief of. And, I think you start with the media. You can look at the general public. You can look at legislatures. You can look at the courts. And then you can look on campus, the campus administrators, and including campus constituents like student athletes. So over time, this idea of the former NCAA model, what the late great Miles Brand termed the collegiate model, over time, folks began to conclude that it wasn't a fair deal, especially in the Division I for student athletes who participate in sports that generate the most. They generate a significant amount of revenue. So, like it or not, the fact I think right now is that a lot of really important external constituents feel that the current NCAA model is broken and needs to be replaced. What that model may look like, it's hard to say, but there are external groups out there in legislatures and in the courts that may help to decide that issue for the NCAA. So that's why I think it's an important inflection point, both from an internal and external perspective.
So let's say I'm a new president coming into my role. Maybe it's my first time as a president anywhere. I'm in a Division III institution. Let's start there.
Sure.
And I'm hearing transformation, change, but I don't even have any perspective to put it back on because I was in academia or I was outside the institution.
Right.
So what things should I be paying attention to, like sort of a shorthand as to how I should guide my institution in this moment in time?
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe set the baseline. There's a lot of sort of 101 information that I think isn't well known among higher ed administrators about intercollegiate athletics, and I think it's important to understand. So we talked about the size of the organization, how big it is, and how complex it is, and the diversity of the NCAA membership. The fact that 40% of the NCAA members are Division III, which don't award athletics aid, and the rest are divided up pretty evenly. Division I's about 40%, and the rest are in Division II. Another thing that I think it's important to understand is how collegiate athletics are funded. and how the NCAA is funded. And those aren't exactly the same thing. And there's an important distinction. I'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of the NCAA, about 90% of the NCAA's funding, directly or indirectly, comes from one source, and that's the Division I men's basketball tournament. That contract produces about $1 billion a year for the NCAA. There was an 8-year contract, and now the NCAA is about to begin its 8-year extension, which will run through 2032. It's a lot of money, but I think most folks would recognize having all your revenue from one source isn't the best business model, but the reality is that is what it is. In terms of how that money is divided, most of that money goes to Division I, which I think is understandable because that's where most of it's generated. So although most of the membership in the NCAA is not in Division I, it's kind of the golden rule, he who lights the gold makes the rules kind of decision. But the other divisions are guaranteed a minimal amount of money. Division II is guaranteed about a little over 4%. Division III is guaranteed a little over 3%. There's about 20% that's guaranteed for association-wide programs that support the entire association. And then, about 3% of the rest of that money goes to Division I. When you look at Division I, there's another major revenue source that's out there that the NCAA does not control, and that's football. So you've got a very large source of revenue related to football, not only on campus, but also through the college football playoff. And so when you look at Division I and how it's divided up, you've got about 60 schools that are considered members of the Autonomy 5 conferences, the Power 5 conferences, the Big 10, the ACC, the Big 12, the SEC, and the Pac-12. Most of the college football money, but not all of it, goes to those Autonomy 5 schools. The college football playoff is getting ready to expand. That contract's going to go to about $2 billion a year. So you're talking numbers already that are larger than the annual NCAA payout. You've got another group or so of about 60 schools that play football against those schools, but they're not members of the Power 5. They're basically called the Group of 5. And then you've got another 120 schools that play smaller Division I football. They do play for a Division I championship. And then you've got another about 120 schools that don't have football at all. So if you look at 360 schools within Division I, there's a lot of diversity within those schools. Getting back to the financial point, though, only about 40 schools within that 360 Division I membership consistently operate their athletics program at a surplus every year. Only about 40 or so, 45 schools make money in their Division I athletics program every year. So I think it's important to note at a lot of schools, athletics does not make money. Athletics is sort of it's an important activity because it provides an identity for the institution. It's important activity because at some schools there's a belief in the commitment to public entertainment, but it doesn't necessarily provide a financial benefit for the institution. So it's important to note that at a lot of schools, athletics doesn't make money. The other trend I think that's important to note is that among those schools that are making money in athletics, almost all of them are part of this Power 5 group. You just give you an example. One of those Power 5 conferences, the Big 10. The Big 10 just signed a 7-year, $7 billion media agreement. So you've got 7 schools that basically are going to make as much money on their own because of their Big 10 affiliation as the entire NCAA is going to make every year through its primary revenue source. The reason why I think that's important to note is that because the haves and the have-nots can already sort of be easily, not easily, but roughly identified within the NCAA and within Division I. The way these trends are headed, I think those differences potentially are going to only be exacerbated. I think you're going to see more and more revenue allocated to a smaller and smaller group of folks. And there are other external pressures that are sort of making revenue and resources even more critical, things like NIL and potentially looking at student athletes as employees. And I think we can and should talk about that more in a minute. But I think it's just really important to note the differentiation between those schools. Well, then why do schools that aren't offering athletics aid, why are schools that aren't making money on athletics, why don't they even bother providing a program, sponsoring a program? And I mentioned a couple of those factors. Number one is this commitment to campus life, to campus entertainment, to public entertainment, and that's that's really important. But for a whole lot of schools, there's an even at least as important, if not more important, reason. Two reasons really that schools sponsor athletics. Number one goes right back to the NCAA's overall mission statement, and that is because of the inherent belief that by participating in athletics, student athletes receive an educational benefit. Athletics is a co-curricular, extracurricular activity, but the fundamental basis of the NCAA's existence is that by participating in athletics, student athletes are receiving an education. It's more of a soft skills type of education, but things like leadership, teamwork, decision-making, sort of all the skills that you make if you're fortunate enough to participate as a student athlete, that's one of the reasons why institutions are offering athletics. I think the second reason is very interesting. And Karen, I would say it's probably one of the trends that I felt was most important, maybe during the last 15 years of my career, especially at smaller institutions. And that is a growing link between athletics and enrollment management. So for a lot of schools 15 years ago, folks recognized the fact that yeah, we offer athletics, and hey, a lot of our athletes, perform, an important role on campus. And yeah, significant amount of our athletes, of our students, may be athletes. But during that dozen or so years, what I think you found is that folks sort of looking at that relationship evolving more from athletics and admission are acquaintances to friends to dating to now sort of being, merged at the hip, if you will. It's become a much more overt recognition that at a lot of schools, athletics is providing a very important enrollment management function. I think that trend's been especially pronounced at schools that are tuition dependent, smaller in terms of enrollment, private, and then located either in the Northeast or in the Rust Belt. Well, guess what? That just describes about 70% or so of the Division III membership. Traditionally, D3s, Midwest, Northeast, smaller liberal arts, tuition dependent. And so that, I think, for example, helps to explain why, given all the economic turmoil that we experienced, starting with the Great Recession back in the late aughts till now, the average sports sponsorship within Division III hasn't decreased, it's actually increased. The reason why schools are adding more sports is because it brings with them the benefit of additional student enrollment. And in Division III, you're not funding student athletes beyond what the general student body is receiving in terms of your discount rate. So you're paying for that student athlete, if you will, that you're supporting them not in any degree different than the rest of the student body. But the benefit, the link between enrollment management and athletics, I would say absolutely is not limited to Division III. I think there are lots of schools within the other divisions where you could say smaller, tuition dependent, private in particular, that description could be applied to a lot of schools in Division I and Division II. And it's important for them that athletics serve that function as well. And I think that that's happening.
Dan, that was a really excellent kind of overview of where we are. And you touched on a point that I really want to dive into, this idea that athletics can help resolve some of the enrollment management challenges that schools are facing. What goes along with that is also investment in facilities. You
Absolutely.
can't just invite more teams and more athletes to your campus without having the locker room space, the coaching staff, the ability to build a schedule and meet it, those types of things. How would you advise presidents to address and be proactive in that space?
Boy, Karen, I think your point is spot on. I've seen case studies that sort of focus on how to add sports successfully, and I've seen case studies that show where mistakes were made. So I think number one, you absolutely have to do your homework. You've really got to look at, you have to recognize that adding sports is, that's only a quick kill. It's not going to succeed if you don't do it in a way that is sustainable. So you mentioned facilities. Absolutely. You need the facilities. You need the coaches. You also need the student athlete support services on the academic side, on the health and safety side, on the mental health side, on the career counseling side. If you're not ready to accommodate that increase in the student athletes and support them the way they need to be supported to ensure that they're not transferring out, then ultimately adding sports is not going to have the success that you want it to have. And I think we've all seen circumstances where it's worked, and we've seen circumstances where, unfortunately, the application of the plan was faulty.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly in my conversations with senior leaders. I can see the initial press release go out, hey, we're adding such and such, or these 3 sports. Yeah. But then all of a sudden, you know, you hear that, well, the field wasn't quite ready, so we have to go rent a field down the street. And the athletes are excited who want to try out your school and try out your new program. But when they get there and it's not ready for them, that doesn't get your program off on the good foot. And I think sometimes presidents don't realize that missed opportunity to really launch it right, to really get it out the door so that coaches are excited, recruits are excited, athletes are excited. Any tips that you might have for them about how to manage that process?
You know, there's probably a kind of a long box that you need to check off, but I think you hit on some of them. One other thing I could have mentioned, probably should have, is like, who are you going to play? Where are you going to play? If you're adding a sport in an existing conference, that's great. That's probably an easier thing to accomplish. If you're adding a sport and your conference doesn't sponsor that sport, now you got to figure out, who am I going to play? Can I get into another conference as an affiliate member? What are the travel costs? What are the student athlete support challenges that I'm going to have? You're going to go out and hire the right coach. If you're not hiring a coach with experience in that sport, in that division, that is going to be a challenge. So you need to find somebody who knows what they're doing, not only from a sports standpoint, but also understands the division. Someone who probably is familiar with the kind of institution you are in terms of your athletic philosophy, first and foremost, then in terms of the resources that are available, in terms of what your student athletes look like, and in terms of how you define success at your institution. Division III, it's easy for me to say, I know easier said than done, but it can't just be about wins and losses in Division III. If you're not evaluating the full student athlete experience, then you're probably shortchanging your student athletes in terms of what D3 would look like. But for any division, no matter where you're at, if you're going to add a program, you got to be sure that folks are going to have their criteria for success defined ahead of time. How many student athletes are you expecting that coach to recruit and bring in every year? That should be defined, at least from a ballpark standpoint. How are you going to help them do that? How is that coach going to be basically plugged into the admissions department? Because they need to be. There was a great session at the NCAA convention back in January. It was D3 focused, but I think the takeaways applied across all three divisions, and this idea that now more and more coaches and folks in the mission staff are meeting regularly. They're trading notes. They're using the same software to track on prospects. How are you going to accomplish that on your campus, but when you're adding your sport? Those are just examples, but I think those are all really important things to keep in mind. And then let's be frank, how much is it going to cost?
Yeah.
Have you run your numbers?
Right.
You know, is it a sport where like football, you're going to have you're going to have significant startup costs. You're going to get it on the back end in terms of the numbers of student athletes that you're bringing in. Is it a sport that may, not cost as much to add because like a sport like tennis, if you've got nearby facilities and, the costs are less significant, but it's important to have done your homework on the financial side too.
There's a lot going on right now, surprisingly, in Division III over the last several years with conference realignment. It feels like especially in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, I'm constantly hearing about these three schools are leaving this conference and going over here, and this conference is combining with this conference. So this is not just a Division I phenomenon.
Oh, no.
But from your perspective in the national office, what trends did you see with regards to conference realignment?
I think there were really two things behind this sort of conference realignment churn, if you will, in Division III. I think one of them is just the inevitable sort of evergreen desire to be affiliated with the best schools you can be, with the schools that have that shared philosophy, that look like you academically as well as look like you academically, that understand you. I think that's number one, and that's not really going to go away. I think the second one, though, is a direct result of this enrollment management crunch that we talked about. The demographics are pretty stark depending upon who you want to pay attention to. There's some quote unquote chicken little folks out there who are predicting 10-20% of colleges are going to close within the next 10 years. That may be oversaid, but I think you and I have both seen schools within the last few weeks closing and merging. I think that's a reflection of the fact that there's a smaller pool of traditional aged students heading toward college. It's a reflection of the demographic shift away from the traditional population bases of the Midwest and in the Northeast toward the Sun Belt. And so colleges are under pressure from an enrollment management standpoint. And I'll be frank and say there are schools that are looking to add members, conferences looking to add members because they're doing contingency planning in case some of their membership is merged or closes. So I've seen that. I think folks are trying to maintain their membership in a way that allows them to sustain their competitive benefits. Some of that has to do with maintaining automatic qualification into championships, for sure. But some of it is just trying to stay together and plan for what's a very potentially rocky future for some of their member schools.
So you've sat in, of course, NCAA meetings with college presidents. I imagine at some point you've crossed paths with the Division III conferences when they have presidents' meetings and things like that. What tips would you provide for a new president or relatively new president at a newer institution, first time maybe in Division III? How would you suggest that they navigate this, and what kinds of things should they be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean this in all seriousness. It's hard to tell presidents what to do, right? But I would. So I'm halfway joking, but I would say it's important to do your homework, and I would start with two folks. I would start with the chair of the conference presidential group, and I would start with the commissioner, because those are the two people that are probably exercising the greatest influence over the conference. Those are the two people that you probably want to get to know first and foremost. And those are the folks whose brains you want to pick. So I would ask those folks to give you their opinion about where the conference is at. And I would say in a variety of factors, we've probably already talked about where are we at with membership, where are we at with sports sponsorship, where are we at in terms of finances, where are we at in terms of dues, where are we at in terms of income, revenue, where are we at in terms of issues that administrative issues. What's the relationship between the conference presidents and the conference commissioner? What's the relationship between the conference presidents and the other key constituents within the conference, starting with the ADs, of course, but also including the faculty reps? Some conferences faculty reps are extremely active, some less so. There's a group of folks that we've talked about, that we haven't talked about, that we absolutely should talk about, because I think that comprises a chunk of your audience too. And those are the folks who on about 70% or so of Division III campuses directly oversee athletics, but they're not presidents.
Right.
We call them the administrative direct reports, ADRs. It's a really wonky NCAA term of art, but typically, it's somebody who oversees a lot of things, including athletics, and then helps to report, oversee athletics directly with the president. But what's the relationship with those folks within the conference? What role do they have?
Yeah.
Tell me about your conference SAC. What's the role that student athletes play within the conference? They should be active. There should be a conference SAC. It should be active. What are the issues that they're paying attention to that those student athletes care about? And regardless of what issues they've talked about and focused on typically SACs are very active with community service. But what's the role that SAC is playing in terms of conference leadership? What's the role that SAC is playing in terms of legislation? What's the role the presidents are playing? Who casts the vote at the convention, and how do you decide who casts the vote at the convention? What's the role the presidents play and all of that? So those are all kind of basic 101 issues, but those are all things that you could probably find out within about an hour phone call. And I think then you can start to figure out from your institutional perspective, hey, where do we fit? And then how do we become better fellow members of the conference moving forward? What role can we play?
Yeah. Dan, terrific advice. I'm so grateful for your insight, your wisdom, your practicality in this whole conversation. Thank you for spending some time with both me and my audience today, and giving them some really unique perspectives.
No, Karen, it's been a pleasure. Congratulations on the podcast. I think it's just terrific. There's great stuff there. It's just awesome that someone like you can sort of lay those issues out for our current and future leaders within Division III and higher education. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.